The French Revolution was a period of far-reaching social and political upheaval in France that lasted from 1789 until 1799, and was partially carried forward by Napoleon during the later expansion of the French Empire. The revolution overthrew the monarchy, established a republic, experienced violent periods of political turmoil, and finally culminated in a dictatorship by Napoleon that rapidly brought many of its principles to Western Europe and beyond. Inspired by liberal and radical ideas, the revolution profoundly altered the course of modern history, triggering the global decline of absolute monarchies while replacing them with republics. Through the Revolutionary Wars, it unleashed a wave of global conflicts that extended from the Caribbean to the Middle East. Historians widely regard the revolution as one of the most important events in human history. The causes of the French Revolution are complex and are still debated among historians. Following the 7 Years' War and the American Revolutionary War, the French government was deeply in debt and attempted to restore its financial status through unpopular taxation schemes. Years of bad harvests leading up to the revolution also inflamed popular resentment of the privileges enjoyed by the clergy and the aristocracy. Demands for change were formulated in terms of Enlightenment ideals and contributed to the convocation of the Estates General in May 1789. The first year of the revolution saw members of the Third Estate taking control, the assault on the Bastille in July, the passage of the Declaration of the Rights of Man of the Citizen in August, and a women's march on Versailles that forced the royal court back to Paris in October. The next few years featured political struggles between various liberal assemblies and right-wing supporters of the monarchy intent on thwarting major reforms. France rapidly transformed into a democratic and secular society with freedom of religion, legalization of divorce, decriminalization of same-sex relationships, and civil rights for Jews and black people. The Republic was proclaimed in September 1792 after the French victory at Valmy. In a momentous event that led to international condemnation, Louis XVI was executed in January 1793. External threats closely shaped the course of the revolution. The Revolutionary Wars beginning in 1792 ultimately featured French victories that facilitated the conquest of the Italian peninsula, the Low Countries and most territories west of the Rhine, achievements that had eluded previous French governments for centuries. Internally, popular agitation radicalized the revolution significantly, culminating in the rise of Maximilien Robespierre and the Jacobins. The dictatorship imposed by the Committee of Public Safety during the Reign of Terror, from 1793 until 1794, established price controls on food and other items, abolished slavery in French colonies abroad, de-Christianized society through the creation of a new calendar and the expulsion of religious figures, and secured the borders of the new republic from its enemies. Large numbers of civilians were executed by revolutionary tribunals during the Terror, with estimates ranging from 16,000 to 40,000. After the Thermidorian reaction, an executive council known as the Directory assumed control of the French state in 1795. The rule of the Directory was characterized by suspended elections, debt repudiations, financial instability, persecutions against the Catholic clergy, and significant military conquests abroad. Dogged by charges of corruption, the Directory collapsed in a coup led by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1799. Napoleon, who became the hero of the revolution through his popular military campaigns, went on to establish the consulate, and later the First Empire, setting the stage for a wider array of global conflicts in the Napoleonic Wars. The modern era has unfolded in the shadow of the French Revolution. Almost all future revolutionary movements looked back to the Revolution as their predecessor. Its central phrases and cultural symbols, such as La Marseillaise and Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, became the clarion call for other major upheavals in modern history, including the Russian Revolution over a century later. The values and institutions of the revolution dominate French politics to this day. French historian François Roard comments that the revolution consisted in the suppression of what was called the feudal system, in the emancipation of the individual, in greater division of landed property, the abolition of the privileges of noble birth, the establishment of equality, the simplification of life. The French Revolution differed from other revolutions in being not merely national, for it aimed at benefiting all humanity, globally. The revolution accelerated the rise of republics and democracies. It became the focal point for the development of all modern political ideologies, leading to the spread of liberalism, radicalism, nationalism, socialism, feminism, and secularism, among many others. The revolution also witnessed the birth of total war by organizing the resources of France and the lives of its citizens towards the objective of military conquest. Some of its central documents, like the Declaration of the Rights of Man, expanded the arena of human rights to include women and slaves, leading to movements for abolitionism and universal suffrage in the next century. Causes. Historians have pointed to many events and factors culminating within the ancient regime to lead to the revolution. Rising social inequality, new political ideas emerging from the Enlightenment, economic mismanagement, environmental factors leading to agricultural failure, unmanageable national debt and political mismanagement on the part of King Louis XVI have all been cited as laying the groundwork for the revolution. The economy in the ancient regime during the years preceding the revolution suffered from instability, poor harvests lasting several years and an inadequate transportation system both contributed to making food more expensive. The sequence of events leading to the revolution included the national government's fiscal troubles caused by an inefficient tax system and expenditure on numerous large wars. The attempt to challenge British naval and commercial power in the 7 Years' War was a costly disaster, with the loss of France's colonial possessions in continental North America and the destruction of the French navy. French forces were rebuilt and performed more successfully in the American Revolutionary War, but only at massive additional cost, and with no real gains for France except the knowledge that Britain had been humbled. France's inefficient and antiquated financial system could not finance this debt. Faced with a financial crisis, the king called an Estates General Assembly of Notables in 1787 for the first time in over a century. Meanwhile, the royal court at Versailles was isolated from, and indifferent to the escalating crisis. While he did reduce government expenditures, opponents in the parliaments successfully thwarted his attempts at enacting much-needed reforms. The Enlightenment had produced many writers, pamphleteers and publishers who could inform or inflame public opinion. The opposition used this resource to mobilize public opinion against the monarchy, which in turn tried to repress the underground literature. Many other factors involved resentments and aspirations given focus by the rise of Enlightenment ideals. These included resentment of royal absolutism, resentment by peasants, laborers and the bourgeoisie toward the traditional seigneurial privileges possessed by the nobility, resentment of the Catholic Church's influence over public policy and institutions, aspirations for freedom of religion, resentment of aristocratic bishops by the poorer rural clergy, aspirations for social, political and economic equality, and republicanism, hatred of Queen Marie Antoinette, who was falsely accused of being a spendthrift and an Austrian spy, and anger toward the king for dismissing ministers, including Finance Minister Jacques Necker, who were popularly seen as representatives of the people. Freemasonry played an important role in the revolution. Originally largely apolitical, Freemasonry was radicalized in the late 18th century through the introduction of higher grades which emphasized themes of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Virtually every major player in the revolution was a Freemason, and these themes became the widely recognized slogan of the revolution. Historian Margaret C. Jacob argues, "We can relate Freemasonry to the French Revolution because in the lodges of the 1770s and 1780s some of its eventual promoters and opponents can be heard discussing how society and government should be, before each would be simultaneously changed forever." Ancient regime. Financial crisis. Louis XVI ascended to the throne in the middle of a financial crisis in which the state was nearing bankruptcy and outlays outpaced income. This was because of France's financial obligations stemming from involvement in the 7 Years' War and its participation in the American Revolutionary War. In May 1776, Finance Minister Turgot was dismissed after he failed to enact reforms. The next year, Jacques Necker, a foreigner, was appointed Controller General of Finance. He could not be made an official minister because he was a Protestant. Necker realized that the country's extremely regressive tax system subjected the lower classes to a heavy burden, while numerous exemptions existed for the nobility and clergy. He argued that the country could not be taxed higher, that tax exemptions for the nobility and clergy must be reduced, and proposed that borrowing more money would solve the country's fiscal shortages. Necker published a report to support this claim that underestimated the deficit by roughly 36 million livres, and proposed restricting the power of the parlements. This was not received well by the king's ministers, and Necker, hoping to bolster his position, argued to be made a minister. The king refused. Necker was dismissed, and Charles-Alexandre de Calonne was appointed to the controllership. Calonne initially spent liberally, but he quickly realized the critical financial situation and proposed a new tax code. The proposal included a consistent land tax, which would include taxation of the nobility and clergy. Faced with opposition from the parlements, Calonne organized the summoning of the Assembly of Notables. But the Assembly failed to endorse Calonne's proposals and instead weakened his position through its criticism. In response, the king announced the calling of the Estates General for May 1789, the first time the body had been summoned since 1614. This was a signal that the Bourbon monarchy was in a weakened state and subject to the demands of its people. Estates General of 1789. The Estates General was organized into 3 estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the rest of France. It last met in 1614. Elections were held in the spring of 1789. Suffrage requirements for the Third Estate were for French-born or naturalized males, aged 25 years or more, who resided where the vote was to take place and who paid taxes. Strong turnout produced 1,201 delegates, including 303 clergy, 291 nobles and 610 members of the Third Estate. The First Estate represented 100,000 Catholic clergy. The Church owned about 10% of the land and collected its own taxes on peasants. The lands were controlled by bishops and abbots of monasteries, but 2/3 of the 303 delegates from the First Estate were ordinary parish priests. Only 51 were bishops. The Second Estate represented the nobility, about 400,000 men and women who owned about 25% of the land and collected seigneurial dues and rents from their peasant tenants. About 1/3 of these deputies were nobles, mostly with minor holdings. The Third Estate representation was doubled to 610 men, representing 95% of the population. Half were well-educated lawyers or local officials. Nearly 1/3 were in trades or industry. 51 were wealthy landowners. To assist delegates, books of grievances were compiled to list problems. The books articulated ideas which would have seemed radical only months before. However, most supported the monarchical system in general. Many assumed the Estates General would approve future taxes, and Enlightenment ideals were relatively rare. Pamphlets by liberal nobles and clergy became widespread after the lifting of press censorship. The Abbés, a theorist and Catholic clergyman, argued the paramount importance of the Third Estate in the pamphlet Qu'est-ce que l'État, published in January 1789. He asserted, "What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been until now in the political order? Nothing. What does it want to be? Something." The Estates General convened in the Grand Salle des Menus Plaisirs in Versailles on 5 May 1789 and opened with a 3-hour speech by Necker. The Third Estate demanded that the credentials of deputies should be verified by all deputies, rather than each estate verifying the credentials of its own members, but negotiations with the other estates failed to achieve this. The commoners appealed to the clergy, who asked for more time. Necker then stated that each estate should verify its own members' credentials and that the king should act as arbitrator. National Assembly on 10 June 1789, Abbés moved that the Third Estate, now meeting as the communes, proceed with verifying its own powers and invite the other two estates to take part, but not to wait for them. They proceeded to do so 2 days later, completing the process on 17 June. Then they voted a measure far more radical, declaring themselves the National Assembly, an assembly not of the estates but of the people. They invited the other orders to join them, but made it clear they intended to conduct the nation's affairs with or without them, in an attempt to keep control of the process and prevent the assembly from convening. Louis XVI ordered the closure of the Salle des Etats where the assembly met, making an excuse that the carpenters needed to prepare the hall for a royal speech in 2 days. Weather did not allow an outdoor meeting, so the assembly moved their deliberations to a nearby indoor real tennis court, where they proceeded to swear the tennis court oath under which they agreed not to separate until they had given France a constitution. A majority of the representatives of the clergy soon joined them, as did 47 members of the nobility. By the 27th of June, the royal party had overtly given in, although the military began to arrive in large numbers around Paris and Versailles. Messages of support for the assembly poured in from Paris and other French cities.